how can B2B software companies leverage platforms and leverage existing tools to not reinvent the wheel there, to not get distracted from core product, but to still serve their customers with integrations well?
Welcome to UpTech Report. This is our Apply Tech series. UpTech Report is sponsored by TerraLeap. Learn how to leverage the power of video at terraleap.io. Today, I'm excited to be joined by my guest, Michael Zuercher, who's based in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and he's the CEO and co-founder at Prismatic. Welcome, Michael. Good to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Prismatic is an integration platform for B2B software companies. Help me understand, Michael, what was the problem that you saw in the marketplace and that have set out to solve?
Sure. I think Prismatic is a pretty classic case of kind of scratching our own itch as co-founders in a way. I had previously had a startup, ran that business for about 15 years or so, and we were in the public safety vertical market. So we served law enforcement organizations and dispatch centers and things. And in that market, we had about 600 integrations that we built to third-party vendors in the ecosystem that makes up law enforcement and dispatch. And by the time we had a couple thousand customers, that's obviously a significant burden, I guess I will say. And so, what we experienced over the current course of our previous journey was, R&D resources were eaten up increasingly by these integrations. Implementations were slowed down. It was a big support burden. Many of you in the SaaS space can kind of probably connect the dots from there around all the challenges that come with dragging something like that, I guess, along in your product. And so, truthfully, I never felt like we kind of solved that problem to our satisfaction in my last business. And so upon, selling that company next, we were still really stuck on this. Okay, so what about these vertical markets, public safety being the one I happen to have experience with, where integration is a really key part of succeeding for your customers? And how can B2B software companies, or in our case, B2G, I guess, how can B2B software companies leverage platforms and leverage existing tools to not reinvent the wheel there, to not get distracted from core product, but to still serve their customers with integrations well? And, we had kind of tried to solve that problem every which way, over the course of my previous life, so to speak. And this time started out and said, okay, so what would happen if you built an integration platform whose sole purpose in life was to serve B2B software companies kind of in that endeavor that I described? And what we've learned since, and what we've kind of learned along the way with our, with customers and just kind of working with the market, is that public safety isn't unique. Many vertical markets have this long tail of integrations that B2B software companies are saddled with.
You knew the problem intimately.
I have the scars, yeah.
You have scars. So you know this. And you're so now focused on B2B software companies because you're like, I was that. There's got to be others. And there's an explosion of SaaS solution software companies. Yep. And we're experiencing the same problem. You're just saying, let me solve this issue that you have. So data integration, this concept of combining multiple information from various sources. Let's just look at it just for a second. For those of our viewers who aren't familiar with the concept, if you had to describe it to like a 5-year-old, I have a 5-year-old. So if you were to tell my son, like, this is what we do, what would you say?
I would say that I have a 6-year-old, so I'm going to translate to 6-year-old since that's, I guess, what's on my mind. But, what I would say is every business in the world at this point uses software as a key part of what they do, either tracking what they do or enabling what they do, or sometimes serving their customers directly with what they do. And because software is so core to what businesses do now, and because businesses have more and more software all the time, that software all has to get along, and that software all has to communicate well. And that's a challenge because different people make each of those pieces of software. And so integrations are how that software gets along, essentially.
Yeah, making sure that they talk to each other. Talk nicely.
That's right. Talk nicely and pass the right data, I guess.
It's like all the software has to go to kindergarten, learn how to play well together. This evolution now of tools to be able to integrate the explosion of software tools means there's just going to be only more and more and more. So the need for it is so important. But you only focusing on B2B integrations. Is that just because that's where you came from and you're like, let me just hone in on that? Is there that much of a difference between B2B integrations versus B2C software integrations?
Yeah, I mean, that's a super good question. I'm sure some of it is a bias to the problem that I innately understand, right? And there's no question that that's the case. But I think additionally, I think B2B software tends to have a set of requirements around, I think, a higher level of service from an integration perspective, or at least a broader level of service than B2C does. Generally in B2B software, at least in my experience, whoever's producing that SaaS or whoever's producing that software will build the integrations that are necessary as kind of a core part of the product. I think B2B is a little bit unique in that, compared to B2C, in that you tend to have solutions that do whatever they do in whatever niche of whatever vertical market they're in, where integrations become part of how you fit into the ecosystem in a different way than an integration that is like what the software does innately. So for example, in B2B, or I'm sorry, in B2C, if what you do is provide a social network app, clearly integrating to whatever is part of that is just a core part of the application. Whereas in B2B, if you're a field service app that works in lots of different businesses, it might have to hook up, connect to 25 different back-end ERP systems. And so you kind of end up with this thing where like, yeah, you could build all of that natively, you could build all that as part of the product, but it gets unwieldy really fast. And I think you have a bit of a different dynamic just because of the way those markets work.
So it's the concept, as it core to your technology, often B2C it will be. So then just have your own developers build the integrations and make it embedded, versus B2B, you just need to have your integration marketplace that this person may use one or someone else may use something different. Now, everything is cloud-based, right? Everything now is.
I mean, certainly most new applications are. I think if you get into most vertical markets in B2B software, you will find plenty of non-cloud-based software in the world still. There are still mainframes running business critical systems in the world, right? And so, I think you're absolutely right that startups are all building SaaS. Modern purchases of big B2B software are almost exclusively SaaS. But we've got at least a decade until the premise-based systems are mostly gone, and probably longer than that on the long tail.
Not everyone lives and breathes data integration tools and love this concept, but I am kind of curious a little bit. Like, do you know the history? Like, if you go backwards, I mean, just software sharing from one software to another piece of software. What's this journey been like of evolution of it?
Yeah, so I will give what is undoubtedly a very imperfect recounting of history, but it's what I know, I guess. So I mean, obviously, as computers and mainframes and then mini computers and on down the line became so prevalent in business, software became increasingly part of the general business operation, and this happened all the way back to the 60s, 70s, probably in some cases before. And as systems proliferated, as you had more and more of them, they needed to start exchanging data. And I think in the simplest context, it's just basic data like, we need our customer database to be accessible in both our CRM and our billing system or whatever, right? I mean, so you can see how it kind of started in a really natural way. Well, very quickly, I think, businesses decided, well, I don't want to have somebody type this into two systems. It'd be neat to exchange this data. And it started super innocently, right? Like all we're gonna do is just when Michael Zuercher signs up for our thing, our phone business or whatever, we're gonna put it in two systems. This is great. And integrations were born. And so, that tended to happen in the enterprise part of the market, in the very large companies. And you can see why. There was the most to be gained by automating these processes in large businesses because there was the most volume in large businesses. And so going a long way back, you had businesses building integrations between, at the time, mainframe systems, and then, kind of all along the development, I guess, of technology along the way, all the way to SaaS. You had large enterprises driving kind of the integration set of requirements and the integration expectations. And that was kind of solved in two ways. Either, let's talk about kind of the 90s and into the 2000s. If you're a big business and you buy a new ERP and you need a whole bunch of integrations to it, you kind of have two choices. You either get some kind of integration platform and build on that, or you hire Accenture or somebody like that and have them build a multi-million-dollar custom set of integrations. And both are probably completely reasonable expectations. I've never been in a Fortune 500 business. I have no idea what the right answer is, but that is the way the integration market grew up from my perspective. And so you have all these solutions that have existed for a long time. You know, you can go way back, but you have solutions like Informatica and Boomi and a little bit more recently MuleSoft. And you have these tools that grew up to do exactly what I just described. If I'm a big business and I have a whole bunch of tools internally, how do I connect them all together? And then we had this revolution a while ago where, you know, tools like Zapier started existing and the plethora of things that are like Zapier. And they essentially said, well, it's great that these big enterprises have all these ways to build things for multi-millions of dollars with giant staff. But what about what I was kind of referred to as like the citizen integrator or the professional, where like, I'm maybe not a software developer, but I know enough about things to wire up my MailChimp account to my, Salesforce CRM or whatever, right? And so Zapier and friends went and built really good ways to do a lot of that. What you're basically still doing the same thing. You're still integrating, you're in much smaller businesses, sometimes businesses of one, but you're integrating tools that are used by that business essentially inside their own operation to tie them together, largely. My CRM to my ERP to my financial system, whatever. What has happened more recently, and what Prismatic is part of, is the endeavor to say, rather than focusing on either a very large business or a very small business integrating their own things, which is what I think most of the history of integration platforms is, well, increasingly the expectation is on B2B software companies for all of that to exist out of the box. Mm-hmm. You buy a new financial software today, you just expect that it has integrations to Concur and Expensify and whoever else, right? Out of the box. You just expect that you can go to an integration marketplace, click go, and it's going to be connected. You don't want to buy Zapier and connect them together. You don't want to buy anything and connect them together. You want it to just work. And so as that expectation has been pushed onto B2B software companies, there, in my belief, is that there's a big gap in the integration platform space for platforms that are specifically focused on kind of the specific things that a B2B software company needs that are different than an enterprise needing to integrate their own things. How do I integrate my product to my customer's ecosystem rather than how do I as an organization integrate my own things? And it turns out those are pretty different problems in some ways. And I believe this is one of the next kind of iterations of the integration space more broadly.
It's almost like it's table stakes as a B2B software company that you have to have integrations, and it's a lot of effort and time so it's amazing for me to just realize, the explosion of software companies, and now that there isn't even a space for someone to just manage the facilitation of information between all the software companies as in this additional whole concept. So when I look at your website, if we just talk about the product itself for a second, what basically someone, a B2B software company, can say, all right, you just manage it, we'll hook into you, and then you'll take care of all the integrations, and we just embed that into our solution?
So, there are kind of a handful of ways to think about it, but I think it's almost best to think about to start the conversation with, what are we trying to accomplish in the end? And in the end, what most of our customers want is they want a really simple marketplace-like page in their app where their customer can go and say, I want to turn on QuickBooks, and I want to turn on Slack, and I want to turn on NetSuite, or whatever the examples are. Click, 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 type in username, password, off we go, okay? And so that's where we're trying to get. Now, if you look at everything it takes to get there, you get into a ton of detail. I mean, first of all, you need to have the basic workflow for what we're orchestrating. When an invoice gets made here, then do this thing in some other system. When a payment comes in, then do this, and at the same time message Slack, right? And those can be very simple or very complex. But you also need that workflow to be able to connect to all of these systems out there, to NetSuite, to QuickBooks. And some of these systems, the ones I've mentioned certainly, are these big SaaS platforms that are very common. And so a platform like Prismatic is already connected to them and already has, what we call components that let you make those connections. But what happens in many vertical markets is, in addition to that, well, you're also connecting to 14 tools that nobody in the world has ever heard of unless they happen to be in your industry, right? So in my previous life, I mentioned I was in public safety. We connected to probably 15 different brands of 911 phone systems. I think you've probably never heard a single one of those brands in your life. And it doesn't matter, but that's very much a thing, not just in the public safety vertical market, but in almost every vertical. And I've actually been surprised in the last 3 years that I've been doing this with Prismatic, how many things I guess I've learned about how deep verticals that you wouldn't kind of imagine really are. And so anyway, as you think about what Prismatic needs to do, we need to provide that platform page or that marketplace page to turn on the integrations. Then we have to give you a way to build the workflows that connect all the systems and have all the logic, data mappings, if-then type stuff, whatever. But then if you kind of go back one level more, well, there has to be a platform this thing runs on. And it has to scale from, you have to be able to deal with the fact that at midnight, your customers might spike with a whole bunch of batch jobs overnight. And it has to just work. You need to deal with the security ramifications of integrations. You need to deal with the how do you log and how do you detect problems? Because one of the challenges with integrations in a B2B software company is that very often when you get a support issue or somebody's upset that it's not working, it actually has to do with the third party that you're connected to and not with you. And that's especially true in vertical markets. And so how do we provide a platform that lets a B2B software company quickly identify where the problem is so that it's entirely possible they just need to go back to their customer and say, hey, you need to call Acme Inc. because their API has been returning 401s for the last, however long. And so I think you end up with this really kind of broad platform, some of which is really customer facing and some of which is like the least sexy stuff in the world, but is exactly what makes this work in reality. And I think in a platform, Prismatic for sure, I think one of the interesting things about it is that probably the things that are the most innovative are also the least sexy in a lot of ways. They're the things you don't see. And one interesting thing about our customers is that almost by definition, if they want to, they can build this themselves. 100% of our customers are software companies. By definition, they can build software. I mean, they could do what we do. The kicker is it just so rarely makes sense for that to suddenly become your core competency. And so what we're trying to do is take all the stuff that's not sexy, take all the stuff that isn't going to be a differentiator for your customer, put that on us. And then the time that you spend on integrations as a customer of ours, as a B2B software company, should be the stuff that actually differentiates your product in your market. And that probably isn't logging, and it probably isn't scalability, and it probably isn't yet another way to do OAuth 2 in a nice way, right? Like what it probably is something that I will never understand because it's deep in your vertical market and knows you and your customer are the ones that know that. So that's really what we do is we take that stuff on from a platform perspective.
This integration platform as a service, iPaaS, you fit into this category, mm-hmm. But specifically B2B software. It's just like that exact category. What do you see as the complexity and time factor for them to use your product and start getting into it? You say once it's running, it's simple, but I mean, what's that process look like?
Yeah, so we actually view ourselves as embedded iPaaS. Certainly, we're part of the iPaaS, segment, but we believe that there's a new segment of that market emerging called embedded iPaaS, which is take an iPaaS and embed it in a B2B software, SaaS offering. And so when you ask what it takes to get running with it, it depends, of course, on what exactly you're doing as a company. But most of our customers will kind of do two things. First, they will build some of their integrations. They'll build the first integrations, the most important integrations to them in the platform. And that can be very easy or very complicated, depending on what those integrations are. If what you want to do is make a message in Slack every time a new lead comes into Salesforce, well, yeah, that's going to be pretty easy, right? Drag and drop a couple things and we're good. If what you want to do is put a dot on the map in the right way when a 911 phone call comes in over a RS-232 serial line, which is a real thing in the world today, that's going to be more complicated, right? And so I think it's a hard question to answer, but just from a start building integrations, it's a very fast process. The second phase is embedding it in your product. And again, depending on exactly how deeply you want to do it, that can be more or less complicated, but we've done everything we possibly can to make that a really simple process so that you can essentially take our platform, embed the customer facing parts in your product and not have to build that stuff yourself.
Is it meant for non-tech savvy people, or is it still meant for the developers inside the B2B software company use it?
Yeah, that's a super good question. So we believe that the people building the workflows should be ideally at scale, business analysts, or what I always kind of call like technical non-developers. They're technical people, but they're probably not writing code. That said, there are some parts of taking a platform like this and really weaving it into your market and weaving it into your product that are probably best done by developers. So for example, actually embedding the UX pieces from our tool into your tool, take a few lines of code, and some developers probably going to do that. Possibly building some of the more complex connections to the niche parties that you integrate with in your market. Like I mentioned, 15 different 911 phone systems or whatever. A developer may be involved in some of that orchestration at like the lowest level. But once that's done, then the developer can step back, and the business logic and the workflow and the deployment and the management can happen without DevOps, without development. And so what we see is we don't believe that cutting developers completely out is the right answer. I mean, these are software companies. Their customers have high expectations about the experience, and sometimes developers are just going to be the best to shape that. But we believe developers should use the time they're going to spend on integrations at something that provides a lot of leverage, so that the rest of the organization is essentially empowered by what the developer did to build a whole bunch on top of it. And I think our platform is really specifically designed to be something that developers really like to use, because the pieces that they need to do are clear and are built in a developer-friendly way. And what those do is enable the rest of the organization to do all the things, the 90% of the things that a developer no longer has to be involved in.
Would you categorize this as a developer tool?
Yeah, certainly. I think, you can probably divide our product into kind of different segments, and certainly a couple pieces of it are purely focused on developers, built in a way that developers love is the phrase we use all the time. How do you make this a thing that developers aren't going to dislike? That said, the actual low code builder, the actual like point and click deployment stuff, that's probably not used by a developer. And so I think in some ways the tool is a little bit segmented between the pieces that developers need to do and the piece that those kind of like technical non-developer integration specialists, business analysts, whatever you call them in your business, that they're going to do.
Got it. For you, when you look at this, what year did you start?
We started 2.5 years ago, so I suppose it would have been early 2019.
2019. Okay, 2 years in. The adoption, what's it been like when you start to share this around? Are people like, oh yeah, they get it immediately, or do you think developers still want to keep it in house?
Oh, I mean, I think there's always a predilection to keep things in house as a developer. I came up as a developer myself, and certainly understand that predilection. I think it's terrifying to have something as mission critical as integrations are outside of your control as a developer. And I think one of the things that Prismatic has worked super hard to get right kind of since day one is that experience. How do you make this something that doesn't leave developers feeling like they're going to end up cornered? Because it's so common that this tool looks great in demos, it looks great in blogs, and then you get 95% of the way and you hit a brick wall and there's no way around it, right? Like we want to do everything we can to let developers, wherever it makes sense, get under the hood, extend it, make sure they don't get cornered. And then let the rest of the organization build a lot on top of that. So, certainly there's always going to be a big conversation in an organization around, does it make sense to have this be a dependency on a platform like Prismatic, or is it something we should build ourselves? I think increasingly companies are very wise about investing in core product, and they're very wise about offloading the things that aren't core. And I think integration platform stuff is not core. I would argue that integrations they're generally pretty important, but the platform on which they run probably isn't. And so, I think over time, even in the couple of years that we've been doing this, I think that conversation has gotten just kind of easier in a macro way. I think that the market is just moving that way, not just with integrations, but kind of with everything. But from an adoption perspective, of course, we spent the first, year building a product from nothing, which means, although we certainly had some kind of early customers that were really active and helped us a lot, I mean, it's not like on day one, you can go live with a giant integration platform that's mission critical, right? And so, we spent that first year, about a year, kind of building, in stealth, and got to the point that, we had a couple customers that were able to shape it and work with us. And it would have been just over a year ago that we kind of took our first enterprise customers live in, what I would consider like a true production mission critical version 1. And so since then, we've been much more broadly marketing it. We've kind of been in general availability for a little more than a year now. And adoption obviously picks up at the point that you start, generally marketing it and working with additional customers. So it's been a really exciting year in 2021 as we've kind of taken the like year and a half of work we did in stealth and suddenly said, like, turns out we exist, getting into the market.
As you stated earlier, this is your second company. The first company you started, you were 19 when you first started that?
I was.
And
yeah,
you love it. It's like just easy for you to start a new one.
It's never easy. I started my last company accidentally. I was a college kid, met a sheriff's deputy, didn't know any better, got to talking to him about software. And next thing I knew, 15 years had passed and I was in public safety software and was owned by private equity, right? So like that was not any kind of like premeditated path. Of course, along the way, we got more serious as we went, but it started as a naive 19-year-old that didn't know any better. I think this time it's more interesting because you certainly, there's still an infinite amount that I didn't know and I still don't know today, but there are some things that I didn't know at 19. And so, that has pros and cons. I think in startups, naivete is a really valuable thing in some ways. I often said, knowing what I knew at the end of my stint in the public safety market, if I had known that when I was 19, no way I ever would have started that company. Super fragmented market, terrible geographic concentration that made it really hard to grow, kind of a very slow sales cycle because it was sales to government. Like I could give you the 7,000 reasons not to get into public safety software. And I could probably do the same with the integration market, right? Like it sometimes is nice not to know what you're doing because you just get in there and do it. And so starting another company was really interesting. It was really interesting to be back at the beginning. I had, I think, forgotten what the early days are like, after 19 or I guess 15 years. You're solving very different problems when you're 300 employees or whatever with a couple thousand customers than you are when you're 3 people in a room with no customers. You go back to asking questions like, who is our customer and what do they maybe want? Like, it's a very different, I think more different than I gave it credit for probably. And going back to the beginning was a really, really interesting experience and was challenging in some ways, but I think my co-founders and I have kind of settled into it.
Hopefully a good challenge that you're like, all right, let's roll up our sleeves. If you had to think of lessons learned from the first 15 years that are pivotal in playing a role you're applying now in your second, what would that be?
I think one of the things that made us successful in the last business is how closely we worked with customers. And that was by necessity. A 19-year-old kid studying electrical engineering doesn't know anything about how dispatch centers or sheriff's offices run. At least I didn't. And all of a sudden, I needed to know how you classify who goes into which jail cell in jails in South Carolina, right? Like, so I had no idea about that market. And as a result, we were forced to get with our customers from day one. Like, there was just no other option. It's not like we were geniuses to do it. We didn't have a choice. We didn't know anything. And I think, I realized along the way just how fortunate it was that it worked that way. I think we spent so much time with our customers in that first probably 5 years of that previous business that we were just so embedded in the way they think, and the product was just so wrapped around the way they see their day-to-day, I guess, that I think I will always carry with me like just how valuable that was. And so, of course, in this business, and at this point, it's common knowledge that that's what you ought to do. I just think I think it was so visceral to me, I guess, that in this next business we've spent a ton of time with customers, and I think even though to some extent our past selves are our own customer, I think we've done a pretty good job of talking to folks that have different experiences and in some ways proving our own intuition wrong, and I think that's been super valuable.
Dealing with competition, both from the first business and now with this one,
mm-hmm.
How do you approach it? Do you pay attention? You ignore? What's your process?
I think you have to pay attention to competition, but not let it distract you in any way. And I think that's like I just stated an impossible thing to do. But I think that's what you should aspire to, not just as an individual, but as a company. I think it's a challenge in a startup, or it's something that's just done delicately, I guess, to keep everybody aware of the market, especially in a market that's evolving as fast as ours is, to keep everybody aware of the market so they can make the right decisions in their day-to-day around, the work that they're doing. How do you keep them apprised of the market, but not have them distracted by whatever Acme Inc. released 3 days ago that maybe does or maybe doesn't make a difference? And so, I think it's a delicate balance. There are certainly some competitors that we pay more attention to than others because we respect them more, is the truth. There are some competitors that we, for better or for worse, mostly ignore because we think, for some reason or another, they're just on a different course than we are. But I think you have to find a happy medium. You have to find a way not to let it distract you, but to still stay kind of on the pulse of the market. And, all of that said, I think much of what you learn from competitors is actually about your customers or their customers, perhaps, where if you're smart about it, you can understand what they're doing in the context of why they're doing it. And provided they're a company you respect, you can assume they're doing it because they're getting customer signals that it's the right thing to do. And I think in that way, watching customers can be really beneficial because I think it can magnify your exposure to the market, especially in the very early days where you're not talking to 100 prospects a week. You're a much smaller organization, and I think you can use your competitors to leverage your signals.
How do you tell when a competitor is doing something and you're like, well, they must be doing that because there is an interest from the customer base versus they're just trying something and you don't know if it's successful or not? Is there any indicators or something you look for?
Yeah, of course, there's probably no silver bullet there. I think things that are big investments are more likely to not be random experiments done by some little group somewhere. And so I think if you see some big investment that's either being done or has been done, then there's likely a pretty reasonable market reason to have done that. And at that point, then you have to suss out, was that for the same kind of customer that we're working with? Because we're focused specifically on serving software companies, much of our competition actually has a broader focus. They maybe do that with some part of their product or some amount of their time, but they spend maybe most of their time or a lot of their time serving enterprises, integrating their own things, like I explained at the beginning. And so at that point, then you have to tease out, we don't want to make a mistake here and think that just because they built it, we should, because they may have built it for a completely different persona than we even have. And honestly, I'm sure we get that wrong as we try to perceive it sometimes. And I don't know, at the end of the day, you pay attention to customers and try not to let it distract you too much.
We actually have interviewed a few folks in the iPaaS space before, but they are in that exact space of internal integration. Yeah. But it's valuable to you come back to your customer. Are they truly serving your niche customer of right. And what your approach of that is? For you, I'm also fascinated because we also have a lot of business leaders that listen to this series, is just how you manage your time, your life. I think you said you have a 6-year-old. Like, do you have kids married then?
I'm married and I have 3 kids, 6, 8, and 10.
Okay. So balancing growing a business, selling it, and then starting a new one, easy, right? Did you find that right balance already with your first company?
No. By the time I had kids with my first company, we were in the midst of nationwide growth. I traveled something like 180 days for a couple years there. It was just a crazy time. And so, of course, I was around as much as I could be, and it's not like I was just, absent, but I'm not sure I could necessarily say that there was what would be commonly considered balance. We were owned by private equity for the last 3 years I was there, and then sold to more private equity, to different private equity. And so, that's a whole experience. I actually had a very positive experience with all of that, but that's a game in and of itself, or a set of work in and of itself. And so I was super busy, super spread thin, and that kind of is probably just the way it was going to be. And so I took some time off after selling that business, which was great. And, spent some time at home and did all the things, the projects that you put off for years, and, some of that, and got itchy pretty fast, I guess, to get back into it. I think, it's all I've known since I was 19 years old, and it's what I love to do. And so, a couple couple of my two co-founders who are people that I worked in the last business with, we somehow or another kind of, got it in our heads that like, we're stuck on this problem and we can do something about it. And I don't know, before I knew it, we suddenly had a company again. So, as far as finding balance this time, I don't think you start a startup saying, I'm doing this because I want to work as little as possible. Like I don't, if you do, you have a different experience, I guess, than maybe I have either time. So, there's no question that we're working hard. The whole team is pulling hard. We're defining a category right now. We're defining a new segment of a market. And, and there's just a ton of exciting work to do. That said, of course, as my kids get older and, I probably have some perspective I didn't have 10 years ago. You find balance, but I am the last guy to ask what the silver bullet for work-life balance is, because I think I have certainly been spread thin before.
What did your wife say when you said, "All right, I'm starting my next one"?
I think she just assumed it was what I would do. I think
it was inevitable.
I'm super fortunate to have been married for a long time. She was, we were together through the whole last company. Got married somewhere along the way, and I think she probably has better perspective on a lot of it than I do. Having kind of watched, and she's an amazing support.
Coming to this concept, you mentioned a second ago about defining a whole new category, an industry. There are several different startups and tech companies that are trying that, and it's not easy. Is there any early lessons learned when it comes to this? It might be too soon to be able to realize that, but well, let's look at a different way. Is there any hurdles that you didn't expect and now they're here and you're like, wow, I didn't expect this one?
At the most basic level, I think when we started, we didn't know how hard it was going to be to explain to the market why embedded iPaaS was different in important ways. I think iPaaS was an established term, and it's a term that historically and still today largely means enterprises integrating their own things, right? And so, just figuring out the words to use to talk to people was hard. And we spent the first year and a half having conversations where it was just like, words just going right over people's head and right by them, and us not understanding them, and then them not understanding us. And, I think that's part of the customer discovery process, is just spend a ton of time with customers and in the market and with prospects and learn how to explain to people the way you see the world that may or may not align with the way they see the world. And I think the truth is, for the first year, we were so bad at talking about it that, we just needed to learn a lot. And so I think that was maybe where I determined that we were in a lot of ways probably defining a new category. It's not like we set off on day one and said, we are here to define a new category. Like, I think we kind of learned along the way, although we're part of the iPaaS space, and that will always be true, we're a subsegment of it. And although we're certainly not the only people that understand that segment, I think we have a unique perspective on it. And in that way, I think we have an important role to play as the market kind of decides how that should work. So
have you found any good tactics on communicating the difference? Because you say it's all about the words. Is there a tactic that's worked well so far in communicating those differentiating words?
It's a good question. I think we just got better at being really concise at stating the problem, which is in some ways easier when you're dealing with people who share the problem, because you have you have a shared vocabulary, you have a shared, set of experiences that you can refer to. But I think we got a lot better at very concisely defining the problem in a way that makes them understand, oh, we have that problem too. And maybe we didn't even recognize it as a problem because we just took it as the way the world is. But I think we got better at describing that as a problem that people understood as a problem. And then it became much easier, obviously, to discuss and here's our viewpoint on what a solution should look like. Then that almost becomes the easier part. But I think helping people identify that this is a problem as kind of a bigger picture problem was probably the biggest thing that we overcame.
Taking a step back, looking at the future of integration and integration tools and embedded
Embedded
iPaaS.
iPaaS, yeah.
What would you predict if you just like look down 3-5 years from now? What's it going to look like, and where are you guys going to be?
I think there's no question that software companies a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now will increasingly rely on platforms like Prismatic to build and deploy their integrations. I think, I mean, probably shouldn't say this, but I think that's true with Prismatic or without Prismatic. I think I think the market is moving that way. I think it's just the right thing for software companies. And so I think it's just naturally going to happen. Now, I think Prismatic is in a really interesting place because I think we have a pretty unique perspective, I guess, due to all of our experience and due to kind of the way we approached the problem 2 or 3 years ago. I think we have a really valuable part to play in defining what the solution there looks like. I think companies are going to rely on platforms. I think how well those platforms serve them is a bit of an open issue as the market develops. And I think we have an important role to play in shaping that, I guess, the way we see it, the way we believe that it should develop.
Mm-hmm. You see the way they will be integrated changing in the future, like it just at the technology level of how software talks to each other. Is it ever going to become easier or change?
I think yes, it will get easier, and then some other things will probably make it harder. I mean, we increasingly are relying on REST APIs or GraphQL APIs. We've at least started to standardize on those technologies. Now, everybody's definition of REST seems a little bit different and whatever. So it's not like this is a utopia, but I mean, certainly we're coming to a place of standards with modern new software. The same could be said for data formats. I mean, we're a lot of the world is pretty standardized on JSON at this point. You certainly have plenty of XML in the world as well, but we're getting to where we've got some standards, I guess, with the way all of that's working. And there's no question that makes integrations easier to build. And I think you're going to continue seeing trends like that. I think companies will get better at building good REST APIs. I think GraphQL has an important part to play with certain kinds of data sets or certain kinds of APIs. I think it can be very advantageous. The Prismatic API internally is built on GraphQL, and it's been a really good thing for us and our customers. I think technology is constantly marching forward and solving the problems large and small, kind of up and down the technology stack that relates to integrations. However, I think at the same exact time that that's happening, other things fly in from left field that none of us are, certainly that I can't predict. I think there is a proliferation of B2B software that is unprecedented. And I think by definition, that means integrations are going to be a more and more important part in this whole thing. So I think even though they may be getting easier, I think everybody's going to be building more of them. I think customer expectations are getting higher around security and compliance and uptime and functionality of integrations. And so I think just as fast as they get easier by solving some of the technical problems, expectations get higher and other technical things become problems. And I think it will be a battle forever.
Well, if you are looking for an embedded iPaaS solution, you're going to head over to prismatic.io. That's Prismatic, Prismatic.io. Thank you, Michael, for being on the series. It was great to have you, man.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll see you all on the next episode of UpTech Report. Have you seen a company using AI, machine learning, or other technology to transform the way we live, work, and do business? Go to uptechreport.com and let us know.